What's up everybody, I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at how Germany pulled off a tactical masterclass against Portugal. So before we start, please check out my book. It's up on Amazon. There's a link in the description below. And check out Keyframe. That's how I made this video. It's how I've been producing content super easy, super fast, and affordable for everybody to use. So be sure to check that out as well. There's links in the description for both those options below, and let's get right into it. So Germany, from the first third of the field, they didn't have to build up against the high block of Portugal because that's not really Portugal's game plan. Portugal sit back in a mid to low block, have high levels of spatial control, and try and break on the counterattack, which is how they scored their first goal. But from the first phase of build-up, Germany, playing with their three central defenders, had two of their wide central defenders go alongside their goalkeeper, and then the most central defender would almost act as a holding midfielder, and then their double pivot in front of him would play as more advanced players and joining the front three in spaces between the lines, just on a different horizontal line than the front three. So this gave them overloads in the half space early on, but again, Portugal did not press very much. They were more than content of just sitting back in their mid block in their 4-5-1 to just absorb pressure and gain compactness early on in the game. The wide areas was then occupied by a single width of Germany in their 3-2-4-1 formation, and then at times, if Portugal did step out a little bit and look to press Germany ever so slightly, the wingers would advance of Portugal, making their structure now look of more of a 4-3-3 rather than a 4-5-1, with Ronaldo at the base taking away a holding midfielder. Germany would then often move their most central defender, staggering him a little in the half space, creating now a double pivot, and now they'd have a 3-2 build-up shape, which adds a little more security in the first third, still going with single width, and then further forward, they then have a three-man occupation between the lines with their lone forward, stretching the back four and creating space for players between the lines as we see here, and even in the wide areas. So now moving into the midfield third, we start to see the clear structure of Germany and playing with their four-man midfield, but playing with their wingers or advanced midfielders through the half spaces with the central defenders, also joining them in the half space and the double pivot, staggering them with the back three, creates a very press-resistant structure, and this gave Portugal a lot of trouble. The trouble began for Portugal when they struggled to maintain compactness and their defenders or midfielders jumped into areas to get pressure on the ball and vacating more dangerous space. So a lot of times, the space between the lines between four players, this is the space we're targeting, and we can even extend it to go a little more in the half space here. So this space, the space between the lines, between multiple defensive players, is the space that's very dangerous, and Germany did a much better job in this game than their first game to create consistent passing options, strong passing options into this area. So when they go between this area or they are able to manipulate this space, they do this by their double pivot, receiving the ball, and then this drags out one of the central midfielders, thus undoing their vertical compactness and opening up potential options for Germany. The back four we'll have another look here. Germany now entering more of the final third, progressing past the midfield third, and we start to see a few concepts with Toni Kroos still favoring the left side but not nearly as much as before, putting him in a more dangerous area and able to affect the Portugal defense, especially the midfielders, and making them defend a little higher, thus creating space between the lines for the advanced midfielders or wingers or even the lone forward to then come back between the lines and receive the ball. So oftentimes with the double pivot, the winger would step, or the outside midfielder of Portugal, the central midfielder would also step to gain access to the pivot, and now we'd have more space between the lines to then exploit for the Germany side. So as we highlight here, space between the lines, and as well on the weak side, Germany have much better occupation of these dangerous areas than they did in the first game, and now still holding width, making Portugal defend across the full width. So there's multiple stressors on Portugal's defensive structure, and with a team that likes to maintain spatial compactness and more of a space-oriented marking system, forcing players to jump and defend across the full width of the field becomes very hard to maintain this level of control in the defensive phase. Another difference in how Germany played was their central defenders and their versatility moving into the wide areas. This was coupled with the dynamic of the two holding midfielders and their ability to now stagger themselves in this match. The front three also had a little bit more variability and playing much more narrow, with the ability to play more narrow, but then always having the option to check back to the ball, and take advantage of the space, as we see Portugal here conceding spatial compactness. And by conceding spatial compactness, they also would sometimes shift to a back five when Germany's wingbacks would progress. Then one wide midfielder of Portugal would have to drop, and then their whole midfield would shift over, so then a central midfielder would be responsible for tracking the central defender coming into the wide area in a more advanced position. And with this jumping of the central midfielder and dropping of the wide midfielder, it did create a little bit more space between the lines, especially with the narrow front three. It collapsed the Portugal defense and forced them to commit another player to their defensive line. Again, the use of the wide area by the German center backs was very well coupled with the dynamic of the double pivot staying more centrally. And by staying more centrally, this created diagonal passing options, giving them a stronger sense of circulation, but this also was benefited by the variability of their front three, again as we spoke about earlier, but now in a different way. Now they show a little bit more variability in how they access space between the lines. So now we have two pinning players higher up the field for Germany, and that's the two most central advanced players, and now we have more of a number 10 dropping between the lines while still going with dual width. For the first time in this analysis video, we see dual width with the wide center back joining the wing back in the wide area, and then on the weak side we have a bit of an isolation. So we have an overload in the right half space, and we have an overload in the right half space, dual width, within an isolation on the weak side. Portugal's low block now, they still went with their back four, and it became very narrow because of Germany's front three. Then we have our five-man midfield shape, trying to fill the gaps with their cover shadows and positioning and their compactness principles between the lines. And now we start to see rest defense from Germany. So their initial back three either would play in a 3-2 formation as a rest defense, being split by each of the holding midfielders, or they would have an advancing center back, as we see start happening here, an advancing center back, which then would leave a 2-3 structure and would require a wing back to drop a little bit deeper. But now between the lines we see two higher players and one deeper, thus creating two pinning players, pinning and narrowing the back four and allowing for space between the lines to be occupied by their player occupying the 10 position, and space in the wider areas through their wing backs starting in behind as well. So now here we see the 3-2 rest defense, which is made up of the advanced central defender and the two holding midfielders. And this was really a beneficial way for Germany to attack because it gave them security without losing the numerical advantage in higher areas. As we see, as many people call it, the W rest defense structure makes up of 3 triangles using cover shadows and numerical superiority. Now for Portugal's build-up, they didn't have too much variability in their build-up, but they did build with 2 central defenders along with their goalkeeper, and then a very narrow midfield 3, as well as a narrow front 3. So what this then led to was a lot of space in the wide area, which they would almost always look to initially use a third man movement to access this wide area. So it would go to the central defender, into the half space, and then out to the fullback. And then this is how they'd gain their first phase of progression, and this worked pretty well against the Germany 5-2-3. Then moving higher up the field, Portugal would sometimes create a back three with a central midfielder dropping. Then their 2-8s would become holding midfielders playing through the central corridor, and their narrow wingers would be benefited as then the attacking primary advanced midfielders in advanced areas between the lines. And then their single width would be held a bit deeper than Germany's through their fullbacks, now made into wingbacks. But the Germany defensive structure was very competent and didn't have very many troubles in defending against this. So Germany played in their 5-4-1 or 5-2-3 depending on their height of their block. So in the mid block here we see more of a 5-4-1 or 5-2-3, you could call it either depending on what your reference points are. So again, good shape from Germany and good diagonal compactness now, taking away diagonal passes from Portugal, who we have seen have just dropped their holding midfielder between central defenders, creating the 3-2 build-up with then advanced players coming through the wing, Ronaldo creating height and creating this 5-man structure, but a little bit staggered and a little less organized than the German offensive structure, with then fullbacks of course holding the wide areas. But Portugal were able to find space. Sometimes when they would go with the back three with their holding midfielder playing deeper, and then now the players between the lines, and it worked best when there is one player dropping just behind the midfield line of Germany, and he was partnered with a player pinning the defense, preventing any of the German defenders from jumping to then get adequate pressure on the ball. So when these players overloaded the space between the lines, they were pretty typically able to find more progressive options, and if not, if the space was too condensed, they'd always have the option to go around the block and then try and progress through the wide area. But a lot of times, and too many times for me at least, Portugal would settle on playing into the wide areas and then look for diagonal balls into the half space with runners in behind when they just didn't have the players for it, and Germany were a little too organized to pull something like this off, a little too simple for the match. But that's the analysis, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.